John, I would love to know whether God exists. I've been vacillating most of my life. I take it seriously. And in reading modern philosophers, particularly metaphysicians, in trying to use analytical techniques to describe the kind of being that would answer to some of these characteristics, there's some very interesting things that emerge. Others would say that's a waste of time, you need to experience it. So fundamentally, how can metaphysics help us to discern what God is, if indeed there is a God?
Well, so I don't think, and maybe your question didn't assume this anyway, I don't think you should be hoping that metaphysicians are going to figure out that there's a God. That's not, I mean, metaphysicians at one point were hoping for that. They thought at least by certain, very compelling arguments that any reasonable person would be compelled by, you can force someone to realize that there's an on-move mover or an on-cause cause of all things. And I think it's fair to say that the drift has been towards the conclusion that you can't hope for that out of metaphysics, because there just aren't arguments like that. Analytical techniques are useful for, even if you can't do that, and maybe that gets more closely to the heart of your question, which is, think about whether notions like omnipotence and omniscience are coherent, and what constraints those ideas put on other things.
Right.
So, given that omnipotence doesn't require that God can make rocks he can't lift, what does it require? What exactly do we mean by saying God's omnipotent? Even as what could the content of that doctrine be, such that it even has some coherent hope of being true? And similarly, on the omniscient side, what exactly would that come to, and what constraints does it impose? One famously important question is whether God's foreknowledge of the future is somehow incompatible with some ideas we have about free will. Does it make sense to suppose that it's really deeply up to me whether I punch you right now, and also that God foreknows right now whether I will or not? And there's been some very interesting argumentation and clarification along that dimension. So that's a good example. And similarly certainly with various other ideas in the Judeo-Christian tradition concerning the nature of God, there's similarly been efforts made to clarify and inquire whether the ideas are even coherent, the simplicity of God, the perfection of God, and so on and so on.
That's exactly my hope. I certainly do not hold any hope that philosophy or metaphysics or thinking theoretically can determine whether there is a God or even help me, but it can determine that if there is a God, what that God might have to be like. That's a difference.
I'm not sure even that. I mean, determining whether it's coherent to...
So if there is a God, that God would have to have the characteristics of those kinds of coherence. It would limit...
I mean, to say it's coherent, suppose the hypothesis that you're an axe murderer is coherent. That doesn't mean that if you exist, you're an axe murderer.
Right.
So even supposing
but if there is an axe murder, it has to be coherent in the way that you've described it.
If there is, but if there is a God, that doesn't mean that God has to have the characteristics that have been attributed to him in a tradition. If the characteristics are incoherent, we know that no being has them. If they're coherent, there's no guarantee that God has them.
I totally agree. Yeah. But by getting coherent characteristics, we limit the characteristics to what a possibly existent God must have.
The logic of it is, if you find a characteristic to be coherent, then you know that it's a characteristic that God might have.
Right, I agree.
And you
Right.
said must and not might.
No,
and that's what I'm complaining about.
Okay, no, that's a legitimate complaint. But what I meant is that God must be constrained by that limitation. That's
Right.
the must.
Yeah. So
Must be constrained.
God must only have
Coherent.
characteristics that are possible for a being to have.
So
that's
let me
kind of what you're saying.
Right. That's exactly what I'm saying. So let me give you just one example that atheists and theists go at loggerheads on. So an atheist would say it is not rational to think that the complexity of the world can be built and created by a God who is simple. And theists would say that in order to, so the atheists would say that we need a God that's even more complex than the world to make a complex world. Whereas theists would say we want as simple a God as possible to make a complex world.
So I think to avoid people talking past each other, you have to get straight on what this ideology of simplicity comes to. I mean, one aspect of the thing is that God isn't a thing with parts. You know, the table is, in terms of part and whole, not simple because it has different components.
Right.
One feature historically of the idea of the simplicity of God, I take it, is that God isn't like the table as being built up from a proliferation of parts. But saying that a thing is simple in the sense of not having a proliferation of parts isn't saying that a thing is simple in terms of its qualitative richness. You know, you might have, supposing my mind didn't have any parts, that doesn't mean it hasn't got qualitative complexity. So there's a background issue.
Is that coherent, though? Is that coherent to say that something without any parts can have complex outputs?
To have a complex range of features. I mean, a number doesn't have any parts, but there's all sorts of interesting things that you can say about pi. I mean, there are lots of things to be discovered about pi. I mean, this isn't a perfect analogy, but it's at least a start to realize that there are a rich array of things you can say about a certain number. And in saying those, you're not presupposing that the number has mereological complexity, I mean complexity of part and whole. Yeah. So it's at least not straightforward how to tie together these two notions of simplicity.
But is this a place where metaphysics can play a role to discern?
Well, I'm helping you, aren't I? I'm trying to clarify some things.
I need a lot of help.
You know, and then, I mean, there's also a theological end of getting straight. I mean, I had a very simple-minded gloss just on what the history of the simplicity of God has come to. There's actually a lot more built in there, and you know, I am simplifying in all sorts of ways. So, but I do think metaphysicians are well placed to clarify and to point out logical and evidential connections between initially disparate areas. That's something that metaphysicians have historically done very well and will continue to do.